A bit of warning about today's sermon. So the interesting thing, Christmas is a 12-day celebration in the church. You start with Christmas Eve, and then you're supposed to celebrate for 12 days after. And so the readings, the traditional readings, are all the birth of Jesus on Christmas Day. And then the traditional readings for the week after Christmas tend to be more serious because the story of Jesus gets more serious pretty quickly. And that's interesting when you insert it into our culture, because we're all still in party mode, right? So like, we're still happy. We come to church and we want something kind of light and fluffy and airy, and then we get these sermons that are like, oh, that is not Christmassy, y'all. This week's sermon isn't as bad. There are some years where the traditional reading for the week after Christmas is literally the massacre of the innocents, when Herod goes out and kills all the baby boys trying to find Jesus. So just if you get to the sermon and you're like, that was heavy, just be grateful it wasn't that one. It could have been worse. This morning, we're talking about the presentation of Jesus in the temple and Jesus's journey to the temple when he was 12 years old. So after he's born, he's presented in the temple. This is the Gospel of Luke. He's presented in the temple according to the law. Luke is very, very clear that his parents were law followers, that they were raising him in an obedient Jewish tradition. And the next story so we skip from birth to presentation in the temple to 12 years old. This is the only story we have of Jesus as a child. If you hear, sometimes you see a news article about stories of Jesus as a child that are not this one. All of them are from books that were written a couple hundred years after Jesus's life. And so while they're interesting to read, they're probably not actually historical. So this is the only story we have of Jesus's childhood. And it is at the same time theologically meaningful and also incredibly relatable, because this is the one where Jesus runs away. So you remember, I'm going to read it for you, and then we're going to talk about it. So this is Luke chapter 2. When the time came, no, that's not it. This is Luke chapter 2, 41. Okay, so every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. So in Jerusalem was the temple. That was the main place of worship for the Jewish people. The Passover was one of the festivals, but really one of the most important festivals. And so observant Jews would have traveled to the temple for the Passover every year. And Jesus' parents, who were raising him as a very law-observant Jewish person, would have done that every single year. And so that's what's being pointed out in the first verse. Now, every year his parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up as usual to the festival. I'm not going to pause every single verse, I promise. But for us, 12 is a child. For them, 12 would have been almost an adult. 13 was the age of manhood. And so they did not see him as a child. This would have been our equivalent of like maybe a 17-year-old. And when he was 12 years old, they went as usual for the festival. When the festival was ended, they started to return. But the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, and his parents did not know it. Assuming he was in the group of travelers, they went a day's journey. They then started to look for him among their friends and relatives. When they did not find him, they returned to Jerusalem to search for him. And after 3 days, I'm going to pause there, after 3 days of looking for their son, they found him in the temple, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. And all who heard him were amazed at the understanding he had and his answers. So in case you didn't get what happened, his parents are traveling in a group. They are going back home. It was much safer to travel in groups, so you wouldn't, get robbed on the way. They assume he's in the group because he's 12 years old. He's old enough to follow instructions at this point. They go a day's journey and they realize he's not there. So they start panicking, running back, and after 3 days, they find him. So there was one time, Annabelle ran away at the zoo, and it took 25 minutes to find her. Could you imagine after 3 days what's happening to these parents' hearts after not being able to find your child? So they come back and they find him, and he is in the temple. And at this point, remember, it's Passover, so all the teachers of the law would have been in the temple. They would have would have gotten together and they would have been teaching and also kind of talking theology with each other because they all lived in different places and now they're all traveling together, and it's their opportunity to debate, talk theology, teach, et cetera, et cetera. And Jesus was there asking questions and astonishing everyone with his answers. And Mary and Joseph find him, and we have this exchange. "Child, why have you treated us like this? Look, your father and I have been searching for you in great anxiety." And he said to them, "Why were you searching for me? Did you not know that I must be in my Father's house?" They did not understand what he said to them. Then he went down with them and came to Nazareth and was obedient to them. And his mother treasured all these things in her heart. Treasure is one particular translation. It's also wrestle in her heart. She kept them in her heart. She thought about them in her heart. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in years and in divine and human favor. That's the whole story. That is the only thing we have until he's in his 30s and he starts his public ministry. That's the one story we have of his childhood. Now, the joke is, of course, that we don't hear anything until he's 30 because he was grounded from the time he was 12 until the time he was 30 after that incident. But Luke includes things very intentionally. And this particular story actually has a number of different sermons. There are so many lines in that story that are put in intentionally. There was one time I took out, there's a line in that story that compares him to Samuel in the Old Testament, so you could do a whole sermon comparing Jesus to Samuel. There's an excellent sermon to preach about a parenting lesson and expectations for your child, and imposing your own expectations for your child. I decided not to do that one this morning. There's a lot in there about Joseph as the father and God as the father and what is going on and that interplay between the two of them. But what got to me as I was reading it this time was the theme of understanding, because that seems to be what gets repeated not only in this story in Luke, but throughout the rest of the gospel and really throughout the rest of the other gospels. So what we see here is Jesus understanding and everyone else not understanding. So that word understanding is used, and then the theme is repeated in different places. Jesus comes in and asks questions and amazes everyone with his understanding. And then what we see is everyone is amazed at him, and then his parents come, and his parents have this exchange, and he answers them, and the line is, they did not understand what he was talking about. And it's interesting that it didn't focus on like they were angry at him, right? If I had been Mary, it would have been like they were livid and dragged him home. No, they did not understand. The focus of the way this is written is on a kind of comprehension and upon Jesus understanding something and nobody else, including Mary, including Joseph, being able to understand it. And let's remember, Mary was hand-chosen to bear the Son of God. So it's not like she's not a holy person. It's not like she's not a devout person. There's something going on here. Now, the easiest answer is to say, well, Jesus was God. He knew everything. Of course, they're going to be amazed at his understanding. But I think it's a little bit deeper than that, because if you notice later on in the Gospels, Jesus was fully God and fully human, but that didn't mean he was born just knowing all facts, right? Jesus learned things the way normal people learn things, and later Jesus admitted to not knowing some things. Remember, nobody knows the day or the hour. Whatever happened when Jesus was incarnate, it is not like all knowledge of God got just completely born into this baby from birth. He learned things growing up, but what was different about Jesus, at least what Christians have always proclaimed, what is different about Jesus is Jesus did not have the darkness of sin around him. Jesus was not born with the same cloud of sin or sickness of sin or whatever image you want to put. Jesus was not born with the same sin that you and I have. And because of that, he was free in a way that no other human has ever been. He was free to love God with his full heart, his full soul, and his full mind. And part of what's being applied here is when a human being is capable of loving God with their full heart, soul, and mind, then at the age of 12, they really can understand things that nobody else understands. The reason I think that is the direction that the gospel writers want us to take with why Jesus knew so many things is that in other gospels and in Luke, the reaction to Jesus overwhelmingly is confusion. He keeps teaching parables, and his followers are like, I don't get it. And all the people who follow are like, I don't get it. And Jesus is like, how can you not understand? Let me break it down even more simple. There was a farmer who sowed some seed, right? And then we have the Gospel of John. We read this on Christmas Eve. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In him was life. The life was the light of all men. You remember this? The light came into the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome is one translation. Understand is another translation. It's the same word, has two different meanings. And if you look at the context of the rest of the gospel, of the rest of that prologue, including the rest of the gospel, there's a strong argument to be made that the translation we have in our Bibles is actually not the most likely one, that it should be the darkness did not understand it. The light came into the world, and the darkness did not understand what God was doing. And of course, throughout the rest of the Gospel of John, we see the scribes and the Pharisees and all these people teaching, and Jesus saying things, and then in the reaction is I don't get what's going on here. There is a similar, there's a parallel that happens in C.S. Lewis's amazing work, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you haven't reread that series, you should go reread that series. It's great. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe is a very thinly veiled symbol of the gospel, in which the lion is Jesus and the witch is the enemy, and then all the people are caught in a curse, and the lion comes to lift the curse. And there's a point at which there's, he reenacts the whole suffering, dying, being resurrected. But there's a point at which he is allowing the witch's people, the lion is allowing the witch's people to take him, to bind him, to kill him. He's allowing all of this to happen. And what the narrator tells us is the witch's people know, C.S. Lewis calls it the deep magic, right? What he's talking about is the scriptures. The witches people know the scriptures. They know what's supposed to happen, and they know who this guy is, and so they're going to get rid of him. They're going to take him, and they're going to kill him. But they didn't actually understand what they were doing. And because they didn't understand the magic, the scriptures, what they were doing was actually playing into God's whole plan of suffering, death, and resurrection by which the curse would be broken. And so there's this analogy that C.S. Lewis is drawing, that the darkness did not understand Jesus. And so because it didn't understand what God was doing, it played into God's whole plan. And it worked exactly like God intended to. And Jesus lived the kind of life God intended him to live. Jesus died the kind of death God intended him to die. And then by rising from the dead, Jesus broke the darkness forever, and the darkness never saw it coming. Because the darkness didn't understand the mind of God, and Jesus did. Now, why is this so important? Because I think the story is fundamentally about understanding and not understanding. And I think one of the biggest challenges you and I will face in our real lived life of faith is understanding and not understanding. We love God with our whole heart, we try to, and our whole soul, and our whole mind, we try to, and yet we go into this life, and boy, does God do things differently than we would have. And boy, do things happen that we just don't understand. And boy, do we encounter situations where we're trying to explain what's going on, and we really, if you push us, have no idea what's going on. And let's be honest, when we're talking about understanding, we're not just talking about exegeting the Bible. We're not talking about debating how many angels dance on the head of the pen. We're talking about, why did my mother die? Why did I lose my job? Why did I have a baby? Why did I not have a baby? Why did this happen? Why did this happen? When we're talking about failure of understanding, overwhelmingly for people of faith, the failure of understanding is a personal and profound inability to see the world the way God does, because it just does not make sense to us. So many things in our life do not make sense to us. And if so far you have never encountered something in your life that doesn't make sense, bless you. You have a wonderful existence. But I'll bet you live a few more years, something's going to happen that does not make sense to you. A few years ago, I preached a funeral for a family that I'd gotten very close to at a previous church. And it was one, there are funerals that are joys to preach, and there are funerals that you never want to preach, and this is one of the ones that you never want to preach. It was a mother of 3 boys, and they had just gotten, they'd been through a rough time, but they just gotten their life together. They were in a good place. They were in a home. She was engaged. Everything was going really well. They had a great family support system built up again. And then without any warning, she had an aneurysm in the shower and was gone. Perfectly healthy to dead within a minute, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, however long it take. When they found her, she was gone. She was in her 40s. And so I did the funeral. I did the best I could. I've learned that nobody in the family actually listens to what you say at a funeral like that. Like the people in the congregation do, so you do the best you can. And I said, I know the right words to say, right? And the right words to say are, we don't know why this happened, but know that Jesus is with the suffering. We know that God sees all of your tears. We know that God will one day redeem all of your tears. And in the meantime, all we can do is trust that Jesus is with us. That's the sermon. And I preached it. And you could tell the family was over here and the congregation was here, and the family was just glazed. Like there was nothing getting through there. And then 2 days later, I got a text from the grandmother, and she was like, "Thank you so much. We really appreciate your presence with us. I need to know because the boys keep asking me why God let this happen. And I need to know what to say." And I said, I don't know, right? The best that you're gonna be able to say is, I don't know. Because I don't know, and I don't understand it. And I don't think they're gonna understand it, and I don't think you're gonna be able to understand it, because I don't think we can understand everything that happens in this lifetime. And it doesn't mean there isn't a reason of some sort in some way, but I don't think we can fully understand. And to tell the truth, that is actually the hardest part of the life of faith, not being able to understand. And I think that's what this story is about. Not being able to understand, even for very, very good, devout, holy people. Mary did not understand what was happening here. Mary did not understand what was happening many, many times in Jesus' life. And again, Mary was probably as holy and close to God as you could get outside of Jesus. Mary did not understand. Peter did not understand. John did not understand. Nobody understood what God was doing, but it didn't mean God wasn't doing anything. The light came into the darkness, and the darkness did not understand it. Did you notice that this happened during Passover? Did you notice that it was happened in Jerusalem? And did you notice that it referenced 3 days? This is all intentional. Luke does not include any of those details unintentionally. Luke is foreshadowing Good Friday. 3 days in Jerusalem on the Passover. Luke is foreshadowing the time when Jesus will come in again, and nobody's going to understand what's going on. He understands it because he wrestles in the garden praying for it not to happen, right? So he understands it. Nobody else does. The disciples don't understand it. Peter certainly doesn't understand it. The women don't understand it. His mother doesn't understand it. And yet on the 3rd day, something happened whereby, in retrospect, they saw that God had been working all along. And there was, in the words of C.S. Lewis, a deeper magic that the darkness had not understood. And what happens after the resurrection is you start to see understanding come in pieces. Now, here's what happens first. The women are the first to encounter the tomb. And they receive the words, and they go back and they tell the men, and the men do not believe them because it sounds like nonsense. And so Peter runs, and he sees the empty tomb, and he sees the evidence of the resurrection. Go back and read the chapter. It says, but he does not understand it. He sees it, but he doesn't understand it, right? He sees what God has done, but it does not come into his heart what God has done. And the very next story, you want to know what it is? It's the walk to Emmaus. And here's what happens in the walk to Emmaus. Two disciples who know what has happened but do not understand what has happened are walking along the road from Jerusalem to Emmaus, and Jesus starts to walk with them. And because they do not understand, they have no idea it's Jesus. And Jesus says, why are you so downcast? And the disciples say, don't you know what has happened? Don't you know all of these facts that everyone else knows? If you know all the facts, you would be downcast also. If you know the story, you would be just as depressed as we are. If you know what has happened, you would also feel sorrow, because how could you possibly know the terrible things that have happened and not be so downcast at the state of the world? And Jesus says, you don't get it. And so he starts to unpack. But this is very important. He is unpacking the scriptures to them, and they are in the presence of the risen Christ while that is happening. And so this is a different kind of Bible reading than they've ever done before. They've read the scriptures, but they've never read them in the presence of the living Christ. They've learned, but they've never learned in the presence of the living Christ. And so now the living Christ is with them, and he's teaching them, and he's teaching them, and he's teaching them, and their hearts are burning within them as he is seeing these words. And then that night, they sit together at a table, and he takes bread, and he blesses it, and he breaks the bread, and he gives it to them, and what? Their eyes are open, and they finally get it. And they understand. And they go from despair to rejoicing because they understood what Jesus has understood all along. And what made that change is the presence of the risen Christ. You go throughout the rest of Luke, and it's the same story. Jesus meets with the disciples, unpacks things for them, but the presence of the risen Christ is what opens the eyes and moves people from the darkness into the light to where they can rejoice at what God has done because they finally get it. They can accept what God has done because they finally get it. And I think the lesson for us, and I fully admit this might not be entirely satisfying to you when you are in the midst of the tragedy, but the lesson to us from this story and from the gospel as a whole is that we will not understand everything in this world, but in the presence of Christ, we can begin to see some things. In the presence of Christ, we can begin to shift our hearts, and in the presence of Christ, we can begin to see that maybe there are things that we didn't understand. But one day we will. I fully understand if that is not satisfactory to you when you're in the midst of a crisis. But let me just give you one small story from my own life. In my 20s, I went through a season of wrestling, not nearly as dark as many other people's, right? I didn't lose a parent, I didn't lose a child, I didn't go through the sorts of things that I've seen people go through. And I went through my own darkness, and I went through my own, why is God here? Why didn't God stop this? Why did God do this? What is the plan? God, you are messing this up because this is not the way the plan is supposed to go. Don't you know what you're doing? That kind of talk. And what was more tangible to me is I think it was my first real experience of suffering, personal suffering. And it was maybe a little bit worse because no one could see it from the outside because nothing huge had tangibly happened. But on the inside, there was a level of suffering that I hadn't experienced before, and I didn't understand why. And I do remember this one moment. I was in seminary at the time, so I was at Duke Divinity School, and I was pouring my heart out, literally weeping at the communion rail. Everyone thought I was real weird. I was weeping at the communion rail during a communion service, saying, why, over and over and over and over again. And something in that service shifted within me. And I did. It was not that I understood why, it was that I all of a sudden went from demanding answers to realizing that I was in the presence of God. And somehow being in the presence of God, while I still did not understand, I was changed. And I stopped needing to understand because I started trusting that the presence of God was there in the presence of God was indeed moving everything to a good end, an end that I might not see until many, many years into eternity. And what I believe is that when the time comes when we do not understand, what the gospel presses us to is to pour ourselves into worship, because the closer we get to the risen Christ, the more the darkness will run away. And the closer we get to the risen Christ, the more the light of the world will come into our life. And even if we do not ever fully understand in this lifetime why something has happened, the more we will be able to live with the love and the trust and the faith that all of the world is coming to a good end, in which God redeems the suffering of the world. You see, Jesus understood in a way no one else did that he had to enter into suffering to redeem suffering. And that doesn't make sense to me, but it doesn't matter that it doesn't make sense to me. Electricity also doesn't make sense to me. And yet, God had a plan. And God enacted that plan, and because God enacted that plan, the whole world was saved. I think that this story is pressing us to, this gospel actually, the story is a precursor of what's happening in the rest of the gospel. I think the gospel is pressing us to a life of worship. A life of prayer, a life of seeking not just answers with our mind, but seeking the love of the God who can change our mind, who can reshape our mind, who can transform our mind. Because the most important thing as you go throughout this world is not whether you have all the right answers, because you won't have all the right answers. It is whether you walk in the presence of the risen Christ. Because the truth is, remember how I told you, I knew the right sermon to preach? I know most of the answers to say when people ask questions, but it's a very, very different thing to know the right things to say and to know what that means in your heart. And what I can do is I can preach the theologically correct sermon, but I cannot move in someone's heart the way the presence of the risen Christ can. And it's different for me to say Christ is with you while you suffer than for Christ to show up with you while you suffer. And what happens when we pour ourselves into a life of worship, into a life of prayer, into a life of study, is that we put ourselves in the presence of the risen Christ. And the risen Christ will change everything. And so my encouragement, isn't this a Christmassy sermon? Isn't this like a really upbeat Christmassy sermon for that week between Christmas and New Year's? And yet it's an important one, because it reminds us why we never stop coming to church. It reminds us why we never stop worshiping. It reminds us why we never stop reading our Bible. It reminds us why we never stop meeting Christ at the communion table. It reminds us why we never take us out of places that we might meet with the risen Christ, because if we stop meeting with the risen Christ, we will find ourselves in a world of darkness when, in fact, at Christmas, the light came into the world. And the darkness did not understand it, and yet the darkness has not and will not overcome it. Would you join with me in a word of prayer? Almighty God, we're so grateful for all that you've given us, for all that you've invited us into. And we're grateful that even when we find ourselves in darkness in this life, yet there is a light that shines in the darkness. And the darkness cannot overcome it. We're grateful that even when we don't know what you're doing, that you are doing something. We're grateful even when we find ourselves suffering, that you are suffering with us. And we're grateful that even when we believe ourselves to be alone, yet we are not alone. We are in the presence of the risen Christ. And so come, Holy Spirit. Come, Jesus. And speak to every waiting spirit the word we need to hear from you this morning. May we not try to walk this life alone, but may we always walk it in your presence, in your company, with your wisdom and with your grace. This we pray as we say together the prayer our Lord taught. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.